Good afternoon. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. Today we have a very important, timely subject that we'll be hearing from our guest speaker. As you know, on April the 1st, just 2 weeks ago, President Barack Obama declared that cyber attacks were a national emergency, and the U.S. president signed an executive order by which there will be a sanctions program whoever is launching cyber attacks on the United States institutions. We do remember also some time ago that Japan Sony was bombarded by cyber attacks for creating some kind of a satire movie on North Korean leader. And the United States declared at that time that was launched by North Korea. So these are the days, and I think today I saw a wire service that American internet security company, FireEye, has just announced that China has been launching and continuing cyber attacks and stealing national securities and so forth from India and many of the Southeast Asian countries. So under these circumstances, I think we are very, very pleased to have our guest speaker today, Admiral Dennis Blair, who is formerly a Director of National Intelligence, which oversees all the intelligence organizations and institutions in the United States. I'm well aware when I was a correspondent in Washington. And also, he was a commander-in-chief of the Pacific Command, U.S. forces. Admiral Blair graduated from West Point, and he spent...
Annapolis.
I'm sorry. Naval Academy in Annapolis, which I've been to. And he was also selected as a Rhodes Scholar and studied in Oxford University. I think he has been very well informed of the intelligence activities of the United States because in addition to the Director of the National Intelligence, he was also from 2003 to 2006, he was President and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Defense Analysis, IDA, which also does oversee not only the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and the intelligence community. So let us welcome Admiral Blair and expect his latest opinions and analysis on the cyber attack and a new China strategy. Please give him a big applause. Let me add one more thing. Please turn off your cell phone or smartphones to nano mode, silent mode.
All right, thank you very much, Murakami-san. It's good to be here. Congratulations on your upcoming 70th birthday of the Foreign Correspondents Club. I guess reporters are sort of like sailors. When they arrive at a new place, they look for the bar, and these were a little scarce in 1945, so they had to create their own. That's my understanding of how your organization began. But however it did, it's 70 years is a long time, and it's certainly a club with a strong tradition. I'm going to talk in more general terms about the U.S. Japan relationship, about what's going on in the world, but leave plenty of time for questions when we can talk about cybersecurity or other specific topics that you may have, because there's so many of them out there. I can't imagine a better time to be a foreign correspondent than right now. The world's a mess, right? And that's good for reporters to try to understand it, to try to explain it to their readers. So it seems to me it must be sort of a golden age of foreign foreign reporting right now as we try to sort out where we go, and you all try to inform your readers as to what the issues are and what governments are doing about them and what's working and what's not. So I think it's a key time, and you're playing a very important role. It's really a transitional time from the period of the Cold War, which was a time when people knew what the plays were. The roles were fairly well established for nation states. Non-national actors were not as powerful and not as a factor as they were now. All of that came apart beginning in 1990 and then progressing on through the other time. And we really haven't, as a world, put together some sort of new order, set of rules, set of customs, expectations, behaviors that are expected and not. So there's a great deal of uncertainty and churn and dynamism in the international scene right now, and I think it's important for us to think hard about it. Important for you all who report it to try to help us make sense of it and to bring it alive to your readers. So in this age of uncertainty, dynamism, changes, unexpected events, I think that the U.S. Japan relationship really stands out as a positive and solid story in a world which in many ways is uncertain and changing. And I think that relationship is to the benefit of both the United States and of Japan in very many important ways. Of course, later this month, Prime Minister Abe will be visiting the United States. Important symbolism in that visit. It's the first time in just about a decade that there has been a state visit from a Japanese prime minister. And Prime Minister Abe, for the first time, will address a joint session of Congress, sort of the highest form of trust and honor that our legislative branch can give to a foreign leader. So I think those are both important, emblematic, symbolic events, but behind them, I think there's a real reality to the strength and the renewal of the U.S.-Japan relationship that is important not to lose sight of, even as we report individual incidents that occur in the relationship. Now, it was about 15 years ago that I was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Command, and at that time, the U.S.-Japan relationship was stable. It was a strong alliance and so on. But I have to tell you, it was not a strong, resilient, growing, dynamic relationship the way it is right now. At that time, Japan was about a decade into its what has turned out to have been really a generation, 20 years of its no economic growth, of sort of moving sideways economically, and its national security image of itself, its actions were similarly pretty small and pretty contained. So Japan was sort of moving sideways, if at all, at that time. And then the United States itself was attacked on 9/11. I was in Hawaii in my headquarters at the time that that happened, and that completely upended American thinking about strategy, enemies, what was important in the in the world. I'll tell you one little incident about that time at 9/11, which was kind of interesting, and I'm not sure much has been written about it. The attack occurred, as you all are familiar with the chaos that reigned in Washington. We out in Hawaii, we were trying to make sense of it, figure out if there were other attacks coming and so on. The very next morning, when our 50,000 or so soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine who were stationed here in Hawaii woke up, there was Japanese security completely around every single one of our bases, and we had about 50 or 60 of them at the time. This had not been asked for. There was no treaty obligation to do it. It was just what strong allies did for each other. So even though the relationship itself was not at a terribly exciting time, there was a strong, powerful U.S.-Japan relationship at the time. But now on top of that, we have, I think, great progress, great dynamism in the U.S.-Japan relationship that is really quite exciting. For its part, Japan is taking strong moves to revive its economy after the 20 years of very little, if any growth. Of course, Abenomics is receiving its daily, weekly, monthly critiques. Is it working? Is it not? But I think what's important is that Prime Minister Abe and those who think like him think that they've got to work on this. They've got to try new things. They have to take action, and that's good, and that's important. In the security area, of course, a range of actions taken by Japan, from writing a new national security strategy to forming a national security council along with its staff, to revising the interpretation of its constitution on collective self-defense, to updating the guidelines with the United States, to deepening the expertise of its Ministry of Defense. Is taking a full set of ranges, and the Prime Minister himself has been enormously active in terms of traveling around the region, around the world, and projecting this new proactive approach to peace, which is written in the national security strategy. So both on the economic side and on the security side, tremendous dynamism, a lot more change going on there. And the U.S., for its part, explicitly rebalancing towards Asia in terms of its attention, and I would say following up that announcement with a continued prioritization to this part of the world, not being distracted by events which are perhaps more immediate, primarily coming out of the Middle East, but ensuring that we tend to our interests in this part of the world, which is the most economic center of the world, becoming the military center of the world. Back in when I was CINCPAC 15 years ago, we said those same words, except we found that attention was distracted primarily to the Middle East. And I would find, for example, that the 6 aircraft carriers which were assigned to me as a Pacific commander were all being sent off to the Persian Gulf to do chores out there. The attention was placed there. And now I think we're keeping the attention here where it belongs and making progress on that. And certainly Secretary Carter's visit here, last week, I guess it was very important in that regard. That was his first trip, besides the quick trip to see the troops, which every Secretary of Defense should take, the ones who are still engaged in Afghanistan. But he came here and went to Korea, and I think that's both symbolic as important. So I think the overall relationship, based on my having watched it for many years, is strong and growing stronger, and I think that's good for both countries. There are 2 specific, very important initiatives which are going on, and the Prime Minister's visit will either cause a major step forward in progress in those areas, or maybe even will cause them to be completed. And the first of those is the revised defense guidelines, which have been under review for a number of months now, and are probably going to be announced and finally approved just before the Prime Minister's visit. Now, this is the first time these defense bilateral guidelines have been updated since 1997, before 9/11, before 3/11, before this Japan coming back. So it's a pretty important revision from both countries' point of view. When you read the words, I imagine you'll not be terribly impressed by ringing phrases or brand new announcements of things that Japan and the United States are going to do together. But those of you who have been watching this space for a while will know that the announced defense guidelines are really the tip of the iceberg. What really is important is what goes on in the military-to-military and government-to-government planning beneath this public statement. And the words we see in the defense guidelines about new areas in which action together could be considered by the United States and Japan will open the way for the solid military planning that has to take place between two countries who are as intertwined in their military activities as are the United States and Japan. So you'll see the words of it, but underneath the military professionals and the security professionals will be given the license to do a lot of important work. In addition, the situation now for the revision of these defense guidelines is quite different from what it was back in 1997 and earlier. In the earlier revisions, the conversation between the United States and Japan was primarily the United States asking Japan what sort of logistic support, what sort of access can we have under certain contingencies, North Korea, others. But now, for the first time, Japan has a military contingency that it is concerned about, something happening in the Senkaku Islands. And so Japan is asking the United States some very specific questions. What will you do? In this case, will you be available? What kind of support can we count on? So I think it's a sign of the maturing of the relationship, and that the dialogue leading to these guidelines have been a much more equal dialogue, with both sides wanting and making requests, as well as both sides giving approval and giving permissions. And I think that's a good thing in the alliance, and I think the alliance will be going further along in that direction. And as I said, whenever some big crisis happens, whether it happens in a distant corner of the world that affects Japan and American interests, or it happens here in East Asia affecting Japan and American interests, both governments will decide what they want to do. But if you have a strong set of planning and thinking that's gone on ahead of time, then once the government makes a decision, you can move quickly, you can move effectively, and the guidelines and the subsequent conversations will make all that possible. So a big step that most of us are quite confident will be taken here in the next couple of weeks in the security area. In the economic area, it of course is all about the Trans-Pacific partnership, and the number of keystrokes that many of you in this room have probably spent on that subject is wide, and nobody quite knows where things stand. Nothing's decided until everything's decided. There are a whole bunch of deals that have to be made at the last minute. I think the spectacles of democracies negotiating free trade agreements is perhaps one of the biggest three-ring circuses that you can see. Interest groups have to be talked to. Congress and diets have to be consulted or not consulted. Trade-offs made in various areas, and then finally, boom, the agreement is made, and this one is certainly no different. But on my side of the Pacific, Senator Hatch is who is the chairman of the committee in the Senate, which will have to pass the fast track authority, so-called TPA, is pushing hard to get a bill out of his committee this week or early next week. That will be an extremely important step. I think a signal that the United States will treat this agreement with fast track authority as it has treated others, and then the final agreements between the U.S. and Japan on TPP hopefully will follow quickly, in turn to be followed by the agreement with the other 10 countries concerned, which will bring a huge amount of the world's economy into a new way of relating to each other economically. In the old days, of course, free trade agreements were about tariffs. It was, I'll give you a dime on pork and you give me a nickel on autos, and those are the big trade-offs. But the TPP takes a step into new economic territory that, for the United States and Japan, very advanced economies, is really more important than individual tariffs on individual items. Things like labor conditions in countries, things like environmental aspects of producing goods, things like state-owned enterprises, things like regulatory barriers that aren't tariff barriers. So truly, the TPP will be the first almost trade agreement of the modern era that attempts to address these many non-tariff barriers and considerations, which are in fact in the future going to be more important than those of the past. And the TPP takes these on. It will set a framework for this sort of a free trade agreement for the future. Most of us hope that it will include China in a future stage, as well as the 10 countries that have already signed up for it, and it will really make a huge difference on the way international economic relations are conducted in the future. And I think it's so important that it's the United States and Japan who are the ones who lead this this era, because they are the ones who not only benefit from it, but have a clear vision of the direction that international commerce should take in the future. So that one is a big one that the U.S.-Japan relationship is supporting, and it's hard to think that it could have been done, and except for a really strong relationship between these two countries. There's another thing that maybe you're not as aware of here in Tokyo about that I think Prime Minister Abe's visit will highlight. It will be such a pleasure to host a foreign leader in a relationship that is basically headed in the same direction and sharing the same goals. Yes, lots of things that have to be discussed, but I think you'll find that as the United States looks around the world, it sees Japan as one of the few countries that is really in sync with the United States in so many important ways. Think, for example, of the last foreign prime minister who addressed the joint houses of Congress. Not a pretty sight, with Prime Minister Netanyahu attempting to attempting to influence important American domestic considerations by addressing houses of Congress. Many of our most traditional European allies seem more anxious not to help the United States take on tough world problems that need to be tended to by the international community if they're not to become really even more dangerous than they are now. Or perhaps they seem unconcerned with events in important parts of the world like East Asia. So as the United States looks around in this new, different era, I think we see in Washington that Japan seems to be a country which is headed the same direction that we are, thinking about problems in much the same way. And I think that will be very evident also during Prime Minister Abe's visit. I think he will receive a very warm welcome. Let me take one further step back and just give you a description of what I think is important to watch in Asia, in this part of Asia, in the future. There's a lot of publicity about military aspects, China's increase in its defense budget, cyber warfare, airplanes buzzing each other in the Senkaku, ships shouldering one another, reefs being built in the South China Sea. So it seems that, there seems to be a lot of alarming accounts in your papers that conflict is possible, escalation from some incident could plunge this area into a war. I don't think so. I think the military situation in this part of the world is in fact quite stable and likely to remain so. The advantage that this part of the world has, that is, by and large, the territorial issues, with a couple of exceptions, have to do with islands. And it's hard to change the status quo of an island without a major military operation, one in which the aggressor has to achieve sea control and air control and keep it for a good long time. There are not the situations in Asia that we see, for example, in Eastern Europe, or the Middle East, in which land borders between countries seem to cut across tribal boundaries or ethnic boundaries or religious boundaries, and this whole business of sort of proxy guerrilla partisan influence conflicts goes on across them. This part of the world is pretty well divided up, and so military aggression by North Korea, for example, against South Korea is highly unlikely because the North Koreans would lose, and they know they would lose, and that tends to put a lid on the sorts of adventurism that they can pursue. In the Chinese irredentist areas that they claim of Taiwan and the Senkakus, the chances of China being able to successfully to realize its ambitions by military force are very, very small. It would run a very high risk in conducting those operations. It knows it would, and it would run high political risk if it did not succeed militarily, which it probably would not. We can talk about the South China Sea, which is really a non-military area of confrontation now. The confrontation is taking place at the level of administrative warfare, declaring areas, declaring that your fishing regulations cover the entire sea, sending drilling rigs, sending dredging rigs into different parts of the world, but it's really being kept below the military level, and no country, not China, not anyone else, wants to escalate it to military confrontation. So as I look at the military landscape in this part of the world, I don't see a real danger of conflict arising. Where I think the future of East Asia will be decided will be by the results of the major economic changes that need to be made in all three of the major countries, China, Japan, and the United States. When you think about it, all three of them have to undertake big changes in the way they do business, and they've taken the initial steps in that area. If you look at the third plenum in China after President Xi was chosen, Chinese laid out a very ambitious agenda, shifting away from and build and export, invest in infrastructure model to a consumer-based model, growing the private sector, getting rid of corruption. The Chinese know that they've basically run out the string of the old model that they had that produced economic growth rates of 10, 12% every year, and they have to come up with something new if they are to bring that other 500 million people out of poverty who are still there. And Chinese economists are very intelligent. They know what needs to be done. It's no secret of what has to be done. The question is, can it be done against the interests that are very solid in the old system? Local governments, corrupt officials, state-owned enterprises that are very powerful, and China has a huge challenge if it is going to sustain the kind of growth that it needs in order to benefit its own people. And for the rest of the world, will it continue to be the sort of economic juggernaut which has been its primary method of influence in the world in the last decade or so? So big bets in China on that. Here in Japan, you all know as well as I do that Abenomics has taken a huge gamble on whether it can, in the face of a very tough demographic situation, in the face of a very established and sometimes guild-like set of practices in the Japanese economy, can the changes be made which will restore productivity growth in Japan, which will allow Japan to resume the strong economic growth which it enjoyed in the past. Again, there's no shortage of experts who can advise the government and business leaders what needs to be done. But the question is, can both private and public leaders find the right combination of incentives and policy decisions in order to get that growth going again, to change things, to open up sectors, to get people to move, to take advantage of women, to bring in more immigrants, to loosen up the service industry. All of the things that have to be done in order to get Japan growing again. In the United States, the economic changes are equally daunting, and they generally revolve around, number one, recovering from the self-inflicted depression of a recession of 2007, 2008. It seems that job has more or less been completed. Most of the statistics are back to where they were, if not before that time. But some of the underlying structural changes that have to be made in terms of improving the education system to provide workers who can move to the higher paying and more skilled jobs that the new economy, which is heavy on capital and light on labor, are going to provide. Can the United States repair its infrastructure, everything from roads and highways to more broadband access in order to keep that productivity from information technology moving? Can we somehow come to grips with this inequality in opportunity, which always was an American strength, but the statistics are showing is not as true now as it was in the past, and it's really that feeling of equal opportunity to succeed that drives a lot of the American animal spirits and economy. So big challenges in the United States too, from the economic point of view. And so the question is, who does it best? Who succeeds faced with these major challenges of doing the economic business in a different way? And as you look at the basic strengths of the countries, they are different in terms of what they bring. I personally think that Japan and the United States, with basic democratic values, getting a lot more value out of the individual than does a place like China, have a huge advantage. Some other advantages that the United States enjoy in terms of the energy boom that we are now undergoing. Pretty good demographic profile in that country. Japan, for its part, has the manufacturing prowess, which is unequaled. Has an ability to tackle tough problems in a disciplined way, in which many citizens, once they realize what needs to be done, are going to do it. Has a lot of advantages. China, for the past 10 or 15 years, is thought to have had an advantage, but it was basically following an easy path, wasn't it? I mean, it was a path that had been blazed by Japan, by Republic of Korea, by Taiwan, by Hong Kong, by Singapore, the sort of manufacturing export path. There wasn't anything very complicated about that. China did it very well, and on a scale that had not been achieved by other countries. But now comes the hard part, the thinking part, the imaginative part. Can it pull it off? So that's sort of what I think is going to determine what happens in this part of the world. Which combination of countries can transform their economies the best and can resume a solid growth rate, and which ones won't be able to, because all of the other forms of power that we've been talking about will flow from that eventually. So let me turn to the subjects that interest you, but just to summarize, it's a very good time in U.S. Japan relations. In the time that I've been involved in it, which goes back into the 1970s, I can't think of a time that's more exciting in terms of possibilities, in which things are moving well in terms of that of the two countries, and in which we have an opportunity to do some really good things. And for the United States, I think this good relationship is coming at a very good time when, as I say, as we look around the world for traditional allies and friends to tackle the world's problems with us, we're finding a bit of an a la carte approach taken by many traditional allies. And then finally, I think if you're if you're looking at the underlying big moving parts here in Asia that are going to make a difference, I would not spend quite so much time looking at military, relatively small military engagements, which I think are not going to lead to conflict in this part of the world. But I think how the three big economies here adjust to their new challenges is what's going to make the difference over time. So with that, Murakomi-san, let me stop and see what questions people have.
Okay, thank you, Admiral. I would like to just ask you to say a few words about the cybersecurity, because your title had that cybersecurity. So
I changed my
just,
mind. Yeah. Okay.
Just a few words so that people.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, with John Huntsman, I co-chaired the Intellectual Property Commission in the United States, looking at intellectual property theft from mostly the United States, but also other advanced Western countries, a large part of which is done by cyber means. Mostly China, also other countries breaking into the network and information systems of big foreign companies and pulling out both intellectual property, blueprints, formulas for paint, all of the intellectual property that these companies would use to make their products, and also trade secrets. What were they going to bid on a big international project? What were their quarterly results going to be? What were they saying in their emails? And we estimated that for the United States, it was hard to pick a number, but the order of magnitude of the loss from loss of intellectual property, a lot of it cyber-based, was on the order of $300 billion or so. If you look at the statistic, that was in 2013. If you look at the statistics last year, Japan assumed the #2 position in the most hacked country in the world sweepstakes. So I would say that probably the Japanese losses are also on the order of several hundred billion dollars a year. So the primary challenge, I think, for both the United States and Japan is to tighten up the cybersecurity of private companies, of the government networks, in order to be able to hold on to the information that should be private. The problem with the remedies that were being pursued by our governments to date had been that they consisted of little more than complaining to the Chinese or to the Russians, and beyond that, doing very little except telling companies that you have got to do a better job of protecting your secrets. What we recommended in that commission report was that we begin to take some punitive action against companies, organizations, even governments that were conducting this activity, and the primary punitive action that we thought would be effective would be denying access to the American market, in our case, and the same thing ought to be true for Japan. If a company is identified as one that has profited from stealing trade secrets, then it should not be able to use our banking systems. It should not be able to ship products into our country. It should not be able to list on our stock exchanges. It should not be able to do any business in our countries. Little was done on that recommendation for about a year and a half until very recently, as Murakomi said, the President issued an executive order which basically said that if a company or individual was found to have stolen intellectual property, then there was a range of punitive sanctions that could be taken by the executive branch against that company or organization. And so that's a good that's a good move forward. So if I had to rank the cybersecurity problems, I'd say that's number one, getting a handle on our own vulnerabilities. There are many in China who realize that this is a self-defeating strategy for China over the long term, that there will come a time, in fact the time probably is now, in which China needs to protect intellectual property for its own purposes. It cannot just live off of the research and development and discoveries of other countries. And you will find a small number of people in China who believe that and are ready to act on that. China actually does have a fairly decent copyright protection and intellectual property protection set of laws on the books. They simply are not enforced against on the behalf of foreign companies very much. Sometimes, but generally, but more often than not, they are not. So I think those who say that eventually China will act in this area as it has in others in its own interest as it matures are probably true, but that could be 10, 15, 20 years worth of American and Japanese and European companies being completely stolen blind by this sort of activity and being hurt badly in the meantime. So that's kind of number one. At the other end of the spectrum, I look pretty closely, both when I was a military commander and as a director of national intelligence, at this whole business of cyber war. Is this the new form of warfare comparable to, say, nuclear war or chemical war or weapons of mass destruction of all kinds? I think the one thing it has in common with that is that there will be a sort of a mutual deterrence in the cybersecurity area at the large scale level. It's still true that in the balance between attack and defense in cyber, the advantage is with the attacker. It is a lot easier to screw up somebody else's systems that control large sections of their economy than it is to defend them. And once this kind of attack got loose and nation states really began using it, all nation states would suffer, including China, including Russia, including the other countries that are doing a lot of probing and a lot of intelligence gathering with cyber. So I think that I think that in my conversations with other leaders around the world, there's a certain understandable and I think good reluctance to turn loose cyber weapons on civilian populations. It certainly would be a form of the military form of warfare. But the trouble is also that in many cases, civilian and military systems are intertwined. The classic example is GPS, the global positioning system, originally developed as a military system, but used not only to get you in your taxi from here to a place that you don't know how to find on your own, but it's also used for timing all of the international financial transactions in the world down to the millisecond. And should a nation state take action against the GPS system in another country in a major scale, there's no telling which way the damage would fall. So it's difficult in many cases. The same is true for communication systems. Military communications and civilian communications are intertwined. Once you break the message into the little bits, they all go on the same fiber optic cables or on the same satellite links among countries, and it's very difficult to try to conduct a military cyber attack without having large collateral cyber offenses. So I think there's a sort of a common sense deterrence aspect to large-scale cyber war, which I think most responsible countries will shy away from. It was not too long ago I had a conversation with a Chinese interlocutor who said, well, you know, we used to think that you Westerners lived in all glass houses and we lived in all stone houses from a cyber point of view, and therefore cyber warfare was very much to our advantage since we weren't vulnerable. And now we're realizing we have a few windows here. So I think there is going to be a certain amount of deterrence there. So anyway, that's the high and the low end of cyber.
Thank you, Admiral. I forgot to introduce the moderator. I'm Yoshio Murakami, formerly of the Asahi Shimbun. Now we'll go to the Q&A, and please identify yourself and your affiliation before you ask questions, and make it short because we have got very few minutes left. Yes.
Siegfried Knedel, freelancer from Germany. Japan is building now a new military base for the U.S. Marines in Okinawa. But there is a lot of resistance from the local people. And on the other side, some military analysts doubt if it makes sense to build a new base in Okinawa, in Henoko. And they say, and even I think Senator McCain is one of criticizer. They say it doesn't make sense to have on such a small place so many American troops. It's a very easy target for the Chinese missile on a near Chinese mainland. So would it not better to bring the American troops to many other places, perhaps in Japan? And does it make sense to build these bases in Henoko now?
Yes, it makes sense to build that base. Generally, in military planning, there are places that you have to support your forces in peacetime most of the time, and generally bringing them together is efficient from a logistics point of view. And then when the tension level goes up, when the defense condition goes up, you disperse to other places. It would be no different in Japan than it is in any other place. And the type of aircraft that will be placed at Henoko, the Osprey aircraft, are uniquely able to disperse when there's danger. So I think Henoko makes a great deal of sense. Last time I talked to Senator McCain, he was in favor of it, so I think it ought to go forward.
Thank you. My name is Tim Horniak, IDG News Service. Last month, China finally admitted that it has a cyber warfare unit. I'm sure you saw reports about that. I was wondering, how would you characterize the strategy of China and perhaps North Korea as well in terms of cyber warfare? What are they doing on a regular basis? What are they trying to achieve? Thanks.
I think the Chinese are mainly involved in intelligence activities now. They're trying to break in anywhere they can and take as much information as they can. From a technical point of view, it's really the access that is the hard part. Conducting a cyber attack once you're inside somebody's network is pretty easy, and if you can get in there in the first place in peacetime, you can extract information, you can implant various algorithms that will allow you to either deceive or to degrade or shut down that network in future. So I think China is involved in a combination of intelligence gathering, preparation for potential attacks in case of conflict. And everybody else in the world is doing the same thing. It's pretty traditional military activity. The place that China is going beyond what the other countries are doing is, number one, they are using their military hackers to moonlight to do industrial espionage, which is not done by the United States or Japan or countries like them. And also the sort of lack of sophistication and brazenness of the Chinese approach is just quite different, and so they're just blundering away at trying to hack in anywhere they can, including all of your organizations, by the way.
Good afternoon. My name is Nathalie Stucky for Sopress, So Film in France. We have recently seen that, for example, the U.S. government authorities can seize assets from companies, even those based overseas. I am specifically thinking about the $5 million that the DEA has seized from a North American branch of a Japan-based Bitcoin company, Mt. Gox. My question is about Japan. So, does Japan have a significant cybersecurity task force? In the U.S., you seem to have the secret services to deal with cybercrime and the darknet, such as Silk Road. How efficient is the Japan NPA cybercrime unit to investigate the cyber attacks conducted against Mt. Gox? I think cybercrime is cross-border. Is there a joint investigation with the U.S.? Most of the victims of Mt. Gox are global, and a year has passed, and since the Bitcoin have disappeared, we haven't heard anything from the police, from either country. So, can you please explain?
The whole business of cooperation against cybercrime is evolving in the international relations. All countries agree on a couple of categories of things as being crime. One is child pornography. A second is ATM theft, for example. And when a national police force is investigating one of those and traces an IP address to another country, there's generally pretty good cooperation going to the other country and saying, where's this, who lives at this IP address, and is that in fact a child pornography ring or a ring? And for example, ATM theft rings in Russia have been taken down with cooperation from the Russian security forces. At the end, so that's sort of here. At the high end, when you're talking about the sort of military preparations I was talking about earlier, of course, countries are competing, they're not cooperating. So the question is this middle area. And I think the trick is to sort of widen the number of areas that all countries consider are crimes, and then we will see the same cooperation that we do see. Because it's simply too easy to route your attacks through servers and routers in other countries, and unless there is an agreement with the law enforcement authorities in that country that they will assist in tracking down that sort of crime, then you're reduced to trying to go back down the route that you were attacked, which can be done, but it's difficult, time-consuming, harder to do than it is to undo. But that was a sort of thing, for example, that the United States did in order to identify the source of the Sony attacks as North Korea. So it can be done. And we've read the recent reports from companies like Mandiant and FireEye, which can identify specific People's Liberation Army units that are actually doing the hacking. So you can do it out of your own country. And Japanese forensic cyber investigators can do the same thing. But if you want to do it at a pretty fast speed and have some penalties at the end when you find somebody, it's really this international cooperation that's necessary.
Over there, yeah.
Tim Kelly from Reuters. With Japan's greater flexibility militarily with collective self-defense and new guidelines, could you give us a couple of maybe specific operational areas where you think the Japanese can have a role that they don't currently perform in the alliance? And just separately, Section 215 of the Patriot Act is going to lapse by June the 1st. I think you've addressed this question back in 2009. Whether it should be extended or not. Do you believe that Section 215 should be extended by Congress, and do you think it will be extended?
The area that is right now an important area for Japan to reinterpret its collective defense provision has to do with missile defense cooperation with the United States and the Republic of Korea. North Korea has missiles that can range where we're sitting right now, all of the peninsula of South Korea, U.S. bases that are in this part of the world, and they have probably something that'll reach the United States, although it won't be real accurate, but you don't want to take a chance on where it lands. So the best kind of defense of that is a linked set of radars, other sensors, and anti-missile missiles with the United States and Korea and Japan. And that's a huge area in which Japan and the guidelines, I hope, will make a difference in terms of our being able to work together. So you don't sit there and try to calculate who exactly is that missile going towards before you make a national decision to shoot it down. And any missile going in a dangerous direction out of North Korea ought to be shot down. So that's a big one. On Section 215, for those of you who don't follow the American legal code, that was the legislation that under which the National Security Agency would, when there was a phone call to the United States from an overseas telephone that was associated with a terrorist group, under Section 215, the NSA would determine who in the United States had made that phone call or received that phone call, turn that information over to the FBI as part of an investigation of whether there was a terrorist threat in the country. And I think that should be extended. There are a number of ways that those who believe that authority could be abused can be strengthened. And I'm all for those being done, but knowing those specific phone numbers to which a known overseas terrorist is calling in the United States is a pretty valuable piece of intelligence that I think the law enforcement authorities ought to have, and as a part of trying to defend Americans.
Martin Kölling with the German financial daily Handelsblatt. You mentioned international cooperation. There, of course, we know that the states are cooperating quite a lot in the field of also cybersecurity. But how big is the impact of Snowden and the documents, especially on the German-US relationships? Because in Germany now, China might be seen as a threat, but the United States are seen as a threat too. So on the grassroots level in the German population, there's a lot of resistance against increased cooperation between Germany and the United States. So how do you think, what can be done to solve this problem, and how can the two states work together to increase the security of both their companies? Right.
I understand the German concern. I think it's hugely overwrought. I think the standard to apply to intelligence is not so much the collection as the use to which it is put. The technology has made collection a relatively trivial matter, and most of the collection in the world is done not by governments, but by commercial companies who keep all of your Gmail, what you say on all of your Gmail accounts, and the clicks that you make on all of your websites, and then they apply some pretty clever engineers and pretty clever algorithms to it to figure out how they can get some information that they can sell to another company, which can then advertise something to you. And that's done routinely with no supervision. I think the thing to look at is what is done with that information by governments that collect it. And I would argue that in the case of Section 215, which we referred to earlier, there is no American no innocent American whose life has been made more difficult as a result of a telephone call that he may have received or she may have received from an overseas terrorist. There's nobody who has been hassled as they were in the McCarthy era. No FBI agent has knocked on doors in the middle of the night and taken them away. No job has been blacklisted. This has just been one input into a very careful investigation by the FBI and other services. So there's been no harm. I would say the same is true in Germany. The intelligence collection that the United States has done in Germany has not resulted in harm to Chancellor Merkel or German policies or any German citizens. And the reason that countries collect intelligence against other countries who they're allied with in many different areas is because there are often people within those countries who are not friendly to the United States, who are not friendly to Germany, who may be conducting espionage themselves. And so countries keep an eye on individuals within other countries, whether they're allies or not. The other reason is that even allies tend to surprise allies and come up with things that countries wish they'd known about a few hours ahead of time or a few days ahead of time. Sometimes forewarning on that is gained by asking diplomats of that country. Sometimes you get an answer, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you look for indications in other ways so that you can deal with them. So that's kind of the way the world is. And I think the way technology is going, we should be worried about the use, but the collection is sort of out of control.
Thank you. I think there are some more questions left, but the time is up. And I want to thank you, Admiral, for your remarks. And I'm really relieved in a way that you don't see any dangers coming up in North-South relations, East China Sea, South China Sea, nor anywhere, because these countries, if they think seriously, they won't gain anything militarily. It doesn't work to attack those islands and so forth. I hope it's very convincing words from one of the senior-most military officers of the United States, and I hope it will come true. In the meantime, as a token of present, we would like to present you with an honorary membership of the club, and I hope you will come back and next time talk more about it. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.